Hey everyone, tonight we're going to spend some quiet time in one of the most unusual homes in the ancient world. A place filled with marble corridors, soft echoes of footsteps, flickering firelight, and a responsibility so heavy that even the most powerful men in Rome preferred not to think about it too closely. Tonight we're exploring the slow and strangely peaceful daily life of the priestesses known as the Vestal Virgins. These women served the goddess Vesta, protector of the hearth, the home, and the sacred flame that symbolized the stability of Rome itself. In the ancient Roman mind, as long as Vesta's flame burned steadily, the city would remain safe. Armies might march across continents. Emperors might rise and fall. Senators might argue endlessly in the forum. But if the sacred fire ever went out, many Romans believed disaster would soon follow. Which meant the quiet responsibility of keeping that flame alive rested on a small group of priestesses living together in a large marble residence beside the Roman Forum. This residence, known as the House of the Vestals, stood only steps away from the Temple of Vesta. And every single day, for decades at a time, the Vestal Virgins lived a carefully structured life filled with rituals, routines, quiet work, and long stretches of calm waiting. If you imagine their life as dramatic or glamorous, you might be surprised. Because much of their day was, actually very slow. Slow walking. Slow speaking. Slow ritual movements repeated again and again. In many ways, their lives were designed to be peaceful. Predictable. Even a little monotonous. Which makes it the perfect subject for tonight's sleepy historical journey. So imagine yourself walking through ancient Rome just after sunrise. The early morning air is cool. The city is slowly waking. Merchants are beginning to open their stalls. Stone streets echo faintly with footsteps and distant carts. And near the center of the city stands the Roman Forum. The political and religious heart of Rome. Here you would find temples, government buildings, monuments, and statues dedicated to centuries of Roman history. But among these impressive structures is one building that looks slightly different. The Temple of Vesta. Unlike most Roman temples, which were rectangular, the Temple of Vesta was round. Its shape was meant to resemble the ancient hearth fires that Romans believed once burned in every early household. Inside this temple burned the sacred flame of Vesta. And just beside it stood the home of the women responsible for guarding it. The Vestal Virgins. From the outside, their residence looked elegant and peaceful. A large courtyard filled with gardens. Long marble colonnades. Fountains quietly bubbling in the center. Statues of former priestesses standing silently along the walkways. It was one of the most comfortable homes in the city. But it was also one of the most carefully watched. Because the women living here carried a sacred duty that lasted 30 full years. 30 years of service to the goddess. 30 years of ritual responsibilities. 30 years of living inside this quiet complex beside the temple. For many of them, their life here began when they were only small children. Chosen from noble Roman families, sometimes as young as 6 years old. The selection was made by the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome. Once chosen, the girl would leave her family and move into the house of the Vestals. There she would begin her training. At first, her daily routine would be simple. Learning the rituals. Learning how to move and behave during ceremonies. Learning the sacred traditions that had been passed down for centuries. Older priestesses would teach her how to prepare offerings. How to handle sacred tools. How to speak the ritual prayers correctly. Because in Roman religion, even the smallest mistake could be considered a bad omen. So patience and careful attention were part of everyday life. Morning usually began quietly. Before the sun climbed high above the rooftops of Rome, the priestesses would already be awake. The sacred flame inside the temple could never be left unattended. Someone always had to be watching. Always checking the fire. Always making sure it burned steadily. If the flame grew weak, new wood would be added. If ash collected too heavily, it would be carefully cleaned away. Everything done slowly. Deliberately. Respectfully. The flame itself was not enormous. It wasn't a roaring bonfire. Instead it was a steady, controlled fire, glowing softly in the center of the temple. But symbolically, it represented the entire life of the Roman state. Which meant tending it was considered one of the most important religious duties in the empire. Outside the temple, Rome continued its busy daily rhythm. Soldiers marching. Traders shouting prices. Children running through crowded streets. But inside the temple grounds, life moved at a calmer pace. The Vestals walked slowly across stone floors. Their white robes brushing softly against the marble. Servants moved quietly through the house preparing food or cleaning rooms. And the priestesses continued their routines. Some days involved preparing ritual ingredients. Sacred grain mixtures used in offerings. Purified water collected for ceremonies. Bundles of carefully selected firewood. Other days involved public rituals. When festivals were held in Rome, the Vestal virgins often appeared in ceremonies watched by large crowds. Their presence reassured the people that the gods still favored the city. And because of this sacred status, the Vestals held unusual privileges for women in ancient Rome. They could own property. They could manage their own finances. They could even pardon condemned prisoners if they encountered them by chance on the way to execution. But despite these privileges, their life remained highly controlled. Every movement was expected to reflect dignity and purity. Even small details of posture and behavior mattered. Which meant their days were filled with careful attention to ritual and tradition. And yet, between these duties, there were also long quiet hours. Moments spent walking through the courtyard gardens. Listening to the gentle splash of fountains. Or sitting beneath shaded colonnades while Rome's busy noise echoed faintly beyond the walls. It was a life that combined honor, pressure, routine, and silence. And for 30 years, this rhythm continued. Day after day. Season after season. The sacred flame glowing softly inside the temple. The priestesses quietly moving through their duties. And the great city of Rome carrying on just outside their gates. As the morning hours slowly passed in the house of the Vestals, the rhythm of daily life continued in a quiet and deliberate way. After the early tending of the sacred flame, the priestesses would move through the courtyard and surrounding halls with the steady pace that their training encouraged. Nothing here happened quickly. Every movement, even the simplest one, was expected to carry a sense of calm dignity. The house of the Vestals itself was large and carefully designed. At its center was an open courtyard garden. Small trees provided shade, and flowers were planted in neat beds along the pathways. In the middle stood a shallow pool where clear water reflected the columns and statues around it. Statues of former Vestal virgins lined parts of the courtyard. These were women who had served their full 30 years and whose dedication was remembered with stone likenesses. Their faces looked outward across the garden with quiet expressions, almost as if they were still watching over the sacred place. You could imagine a young trainee priestess walking past these statues each morning, aware that one day, if she completed her service successfully, her own statue might join them. But that was a thought for far in the future. For now, her days were focused on learning. The younger Vestals, those still in their first decade of service, spent many hours studying rituals. Roman religion was incredibly precise. Certain prayers had to be spoken with exact wording. Certain offerings had to be prepared in very specific ways. Even the direction someone faced while performing a ritual could matter. Because Romans believed the gods paid close attention to details. So the training involved repetition. A senior Vestal might slowly demonstrate how to prepare a sacred offering of grain and salt. The mixture had to be measured carefully. The tools used to prepare it had to be clean and ritually pure. The younger priestess would watch closely. Then she would repeat the process herself. Sometimes again. And again. And again. Until every movement became natural. Until she could prepare the offering without hesitation. Meanwhile, outside the temple complex, the city of Rome continued to grow louder. By mid-morning the markets would be fully alive. Vendors shouting their prices. Blacksmiths hammering metal. Merchants from distant provinces unloading goods. The smells of bread, olives, and cooked fish drifting through the streets. But within the walls of the Vestal residence, the atmosphere stayed calm. The thick stone walls muted much of the noise from the outside world. Here the sounds were softer. Footsteps on marble floors. Water splashing gently from fountains. The crackling of the sacred fire in the nearby temple. Sometimes birds perched on the temple roof or in the courtyard trees, adding their own quiet sounds to the morning. Meals for the Vestals were simple but good. Unlike many people in Rome, the priestesses had reliable access to fresh food. Their status meant the state provided for them. Bread, fruit, vegetables, olives, and occasionally fish or meat appeared at the dining tables inside the house. They ate together as a group, usually in calm conversation. Meals were not rushed. There was time to talk quietly. Time to rest. And time to enjoy the brief break between ritual duties. The older Vestals often shared stories during these moments. Stories about past festivals. Stories about unusual events they had witnessed during their years of service. Or sometimes small bits of advice for the younger members of the group. Advice about how to stay calm during crowded ceremonies. Advice about maintaining the careful posture expected of a Vestal virgin when walking through the Roman Forum. Because whenever the Vestals appeared in public, people noticed. They wore distinctive white garments. Their hair arranged in a special braided style known as the sani crines, a traditional Roman ceremonial hairstyle. When they walked through the city streets, crowds often stepped aside respectfully. After all, these women were considered sacred. Their presence symbolized the safety and stability of Rome itself. There were even special legal protections surrounding them. If someone insulted or harmed a Vestal, the punishment could be severe. And if a condemned prisoner happened to meet a Vestal on the way to execution, the law allowed the priestess to grant him mercy. It was an unusual power in a society where most women had very limited authority. Yet despite these privileges, the Vestals still lived under constant pressure. Their purity vow was taken extremely seriously. The entire symbolic system of their role depended on it. For 30 years they were expected to remain completely devoted to their sacred duties. Breaking that vow was considered one of the worst religious crimes imaginable in Roman society. But during ordinary days, that heavy responsibility often faded into the background. Because most of their time was filled with quiet routine. Cleaning ritual spaces. Preparing offerings. Studying religious texts. Walking through shaded colonnades as the sun moved slowly across the sky. Afternoons were often quieter still. Rome's heat could become intense, especially during the summer months. So activities slowed. Some Vestals used this time to read or copy religious documents. Literacy was not common among Roman women, but the Vestals were educated. They learned reading, writing, and sometimes even elements of law and history. Important state documents were sometimes stored under their protection, making their residence not only a religious center but also a place of political importance. As the sun began to lower in the sky, the temple once again required careful attention. The sacred flame had to remain strong through the evening and night. Fresh wood was added when necessary. Ash was removed carefully. And the rituals marking the transition from day to night were performed with the same calm precision as the morning ones. Gradually the sky above Rome turned golden. Long shadows stretched across the forum. Merchants packed away their goods. Citizens returned home for the evening meal. Inside the temple complex, the Vestals continued their quiet work. The flame glowed softly inside the round temple of Vesta. And beyond the walls, the enormous city slowly settled into nighttime calm. But for the priestesses, the work never truly stopped. Because the flame must never go out. Not during storms. Not during war. Not even during the darkest nights. So while most of Rome slept, at least one Vestal remained awake. Watching the fire. Listening to the gentle crackle of burning wood. And guarding the symbol that Romans believed held their entire civilization together. As evening settled over the temple district, the atmosphere around the house of the Vestals became quieter than at any other time of day. The busy noise of the Roman Forum slowly faded. Merchants packed away their goods. Government officials left the basilicas where they had argued over laws and politics all afternoon. One by one, the crowds disappeared from the stone streets. But inside the sacred complex beside the Temple of Vesta, the priestesses continued their routines. Night did not mean rest for everyone. Because the sacred flame required constant care. A Vestal assigned to the night watch would move quietly into the temple, carrying small bundles of carefully prepared wood. The temple interior glowed with the soft orange light of the fire, reflecting gently off the pale stone walls. The round shape of the temple made the space feel calm and enclosed, almost like standing inside a protective circle. Outside, the stars slowly appeared over the rooftops of Rome. Inside, the flame flickered steadily. The priestess watching it would sit or stand nearby, always alert but rarely moving quickly. Her training had taught her patience. Long hours of calm observation were part of the duty. Occasionally she would add a small piece of wood to the fire. Not too much. Not too little. Just enough to keep the flame healthy. The crackling of the fire became the dominant sound of the night. Sometimes the wind moved softly through the temple columns, carrying the faint smells of the city, smoke from distant hearths, bread baking in late kitchens, or the damp scent of evening air rising from the nearby Tiber River. These quiet moments were some of the few times a Vestal might be truly alone. During the daytime, the complex was filled with other priestesses, servants, visiting officials, and occasionally crowds attending ceremonies. But during the night watch, the temple felt peaceful. Almost timeless. The flame had been burning here for centuries. Long before the priestess watching it had been born. Long before her teachers had entered the temple. Even before many of the surrounding buildings had been constructed. In Roman belief, this fire symbolized the life of the entire state. It was the hearth of Rome itself. Just as every Roman home once centered around its household fire, the city believed its collective safety depended on the sacred fire of Vesta. So the Vestal watching the flame understood the symbolic weight of the task. Yet in practical terms, the moment itself could feel very simple. Just a quiet room. A steady fire. And the slow passing of time. Eventually another Vestal would arrive to replace her. The night watch rotated among the priestesses so that no one person carried the burden alone. After handing over the responsibility, the priestess leaving the temple would walk slowly back across the courtyard toward the residence. By now the house of the Vestals was mostly dark. Oil lamps flickered softly in the corridors. The fountains in the courtyard continued their gentle splashing, a constant sound through both day and night. Inside the sleeping chambers, most of the other Vestals rested. Their rooms were simple but comfortable. Each chamber contained a bed, small storage chests, and sometimes decorative items or religious symbols. Compared to the homes of many Romans, these rooms were spacious and clean. Servants ensured the house remained well maintained. The Vestals themselves were expected to live modestly, but their sacred status meant they were treated with respect and care. When the priestess returning from night duty entered her room, the city outside would already be deep in sleep. And for a few hours before dawn, the temple complex became one of the quietest places in all of Rome. Eventually the faint gray light of early morning would begin to appear above the rooftops. Another day was beginning. Servants would rise first, preparing the kitchens and sweeping the corridors. Then the priestesses would awaken. Once again the sacred fire would be checked carefully. Ash removed. Wood added. The morning rituals prepared. And so the cycle of Vestal life continued. Day after day. Month after month. Year after year. To someone living inside the house of the Vestals, time probably felt very different from the busy world outside. In the city streets, political power shifted constantly. New emperors rose to power. Generals won victories or suffered defeats. Crowds celebrated festivals or protested decisions made by distant rulers. But inside the temple complex, life followed a far older rhythm. A rhythm measured not by politics or war, but by the steady burning of a flame, and by the quiet dedication of the priestesses who guarded it. For the younger Vestals still in training, this rhythm slowly shaped their entire understanding of the world. At first, many of them arrived as nervous children, unsure of the strange new life awaiting them. But over time they learned the routines. They memorized the prayers. They understood the movements of rituals that had once seemed complicated. Gradually, the temple began to feel like home. The older Vestals became teachers and mentors. The courtyard gardens became familiar places for slow walks and quiet conversation. And the flame itself became something almost comforting. A constant presence. Always glowing in the temple. Always waiting to be cared for. As the years passed, the young trainee would become a full Vestal, trusted with the responsibilities she had once only watched from a distance. She would perform rituals in public ceremonies, stand beside officials during important festivals, and take her turn watching the sacred fire during long quiet nights. Decades could pass this way. 30 years of service divided into 3 stages: learning, serving, and teaching. And by the time a priestess reached her final years of service, she had witnessed an entire generation of Rome change around her. New buildings rising in the Forum. New leaders giving speeches from the rostra. New groups of young girls arriving to begin the same life she once started. Eventually, when her 30 years were complete, a Vestal was allowed to leave the order. For the first time since childhood, she could choose a different life. Some former Vestals married. Others remained independent, respected figures in Roman society. But even after leaving, their identity as former priestesses remained important. After all, they had spent decades guarding one of the most sacred symbols in the empire. And their calm dedication had helped keep alive a tradition that Romans believed protected the entire city. The sacred flame continued burning. New Vestals continued arriving. And the quiet daily routines of the temple carried on. Slow. Steady. And almost unchanged for centuries. As another gentle morning settled over the temple district, the life of the Vestals returned to its familiar rhythm. The light of dawn crept gradually across the rooftops of Rome, touching the marble columns that surrounded the Temple of Vesta. Inside the temple, the sacred flame was still burning, just as it had through the night. For the priestess who had been watching it during the final hours before sunrise, the quiet responsibility was nearly complete. Soon another Vestal would arrive to take her place. This constant exchange of duties was one of the ways the priestesses supported one another. Even though their responsibilities were heavy, the work was shared. No single Vestal guarded the fire alone forever. Instead, their service moved like a slow cycle, much like the turning of the seasons. Once the morning watch changed, the new priestess would carefully examine the fire. She would observe the color of the flame. She would notice how strongly it burned. If the wood had burned too low during the night, she would gently add another small bundle. Everything done slowly. Everything done with patience. Because rushing a sacred task was never acceptable in Roman ritual life. Outside the temple, the early sounds of the city began to return. The distant wheels of carts rolling across stone streets. A vendor calling out the price of fresh bread. The occasional bark of a dog somewhere in the maze of Roman alleys. But inside the temple complex, the Vestals remained focused on their quiet duties. After the sacred fire was checked, the next part of the morning often involved preparing ritual items. Roman religious ceremonies used many symbolic ingredients. One of the most common was a special mixture called mola salsa. This sacred mixture was made from grain and salt, carefully prepared by the Vestal virgins during specific times of the year. The grain itself had to be harvested in a particular way. Then it was dried, ground, and mixed with salt during ritual ceremonies. Once prepared, it was used in sacrifices throughout Rome. Whenever an animal sacrifice took place, a small amount of this sacred grain mixture was sprinkled onto the offering before the ritual began. It was a symbol of purification. And because the Vestals prepared it, their work touched nearly every important religious ceremony in the city. Imagine a young trainee Vestal learning this process for the first time. She would stand beside an older priestess who had performed the ritual many times before. The senior Vestal would explain each step carefully. How the grain should be handled. How the salt should be measured. How the mixture should be stored once it was finished. These instructions were repeated slowly, sometimes over many days. Because in Roman religion, memory mattered. The priestesses were expected to remember centuries-old traditions exactly. Not almost correctly. Not approximately. But precisely. So patience was essential. After the morning preparations, the Vestals sometimes left the temple complex to participate in ceremonies around the city. When they walked through the streets, they were easy to recognize. Their white robes stood out among the darker clothing of ordinary citizens. Their hair was arranged in ceremonial braids that symbolized purity and tradition. And whenever people saw them approaching, many stepped aside respectfully. The presence of a Vestal virgin was considered a good omen. Roman citizens believed their sacred status connected them directly with the protection of the gods. In fact, the Vestals were given special legal privileges that few others in Rome possessed. They could travel through the city in a covered carriage. They had reserved seats at public games and festivals. And they were independent under the law, which was extremely unusual for women in ancient Roman society. Most Roman women lived under the legal authority of a father or husband. But the Vestals answered only to the religious authorities of the state. Yet with these privileges came constant expectations. Every public appearance had to reflect calm dignity. A Vestal could not behave carelessly in front of a crowd. She represented the sacred stability of Rome itself. So even walking through the city required attention. Her posture had to be straight. Her movements calm. Her expression composed. Meanwhile the city around her could be chaotic. Children running through the streets. Merchants shouting. Animals pulling carts through narrow roads. But the Vestal walked calmly through it all, almost like a quiet island of stillness within the busy Roman world. After returning from public duties, the priestesses usually spent the afternoon within the house of the Vestals again. The central courtyard often became a place for quiet conversation. Some Vestals used the time to study religious texts. Others walked slowly along the shaded corridors that surrounded the garden. Fountains splashed gently in the background. Birds occasionally landed on the statues of former priestesses. And sunlight moved slowly across the stone floors. This part of the day might feel peaceful compared to the responsibilities of ritual work. But even during these quiet hours, the Vestals remained aware of the sacred duty that defined their lives. At any moment they could be called upon for a ceremony. Or summoned by priests to assist with an important religious matter. Their service connected them not only to the goddess Vesta, but also to the political and spiritual life of Rome itself. Because religion and government in ancient Rome were deeply connected. Major political decisions were often accompanied by religious rituals. And the Vestals were part of that sacred system. In the distance, the forum remained busy throughout the afternoon. Senators debated laws. Messengers arrived with news from distant provinces. Crowds gathered to listen to speeches. But from inside the house of the Vestals, those events felt slightly removed. The priestesses lived beside the center of Roman power. Yet their daily life remained focused on something quieter. A single flame. A collection of ancient rituals. And a rhythm of service that continued year after year. As the sun slowly moved toward evening once again, the Vestals prepared for another cycle of duties. Another evening tending the sacred fire. Another night of quiet watch. Another morning waiting beyond the darkness. And so their life moved forward. Steady. Calm. And almost timeless. As the afternoon gradually softened into evening, the light across the courtyard of the house of the Vestals began to change. The bright sunlight that had filled the marble walkways earlier in the day slowly turned warmer and softer. Long shadows stretched across the garden paths, and the sound of water trickling from the courtyard fountain seemed even more noticeable in the calm air. For the priestesses living there, this quiet transition between afternoon and evening marked another gentle shift in their daily rhythm. Many of the day's formal duties were complete. The sacred grain mixtures had been prepared. Ritual tools cleaned and returned to their proper places. Ceremonial robes carefully folded. And now, for a brief time, the Vestals could move more freely through the residence. Some walked slowly through the courtyard gardens. Others sat along the shaded colonnades, enjoying the cooler air after the warmth of the afternoon sun. From the upper levels of the residence, it was sometimes possible to see the rooftops of the city stretching outward in every direction. Ancient Rome was vast and crowded. Hundreds of thousands of people lived within its walls. Smoke from cooking fires drifted upward from countless homes. Distant voices echoed through the streets. And yet inside the Vestal residence, the atmosphere remained calm and ordered. Servants moved quietly through the halls lighting oil lamps as the daylight faded. The soft glow of these lamps gradually replaced the sunlight in the corridors. Meanwhile, the temple of Vesta nearby was beginning its evening rituals. One or two Vestals would walk from the residence to the temple, their white robes catching the fading light as they crossed the open space between the buildings. The round temple stood quietly beside the Roman Forum, surrounded by the grand structures of Roman government and religion. But unlike those imposing buildings, the Temple of Vesta felt more intimate. Its circular design reminded Romans of the ancient hearth fires that had once burned in their earliest homes. And inside the temple, the sacred flame still glowed steadily. The priestesses approached it with the calm confidence that came from years of training. Even the youngest Vestal, after enough time in the temple, learned how to move naturally within its sacred space. A small piece of wood might be added to the fire. Ash gently brushed away. Sacred tools carefully arranged nearby. Each motion carried quiet significance. But outside the temple walls, life in Rome continued to unfold with all its usual noise and unpredictability. In the Forum, politicians might still be arguing about laws or military campaigns. News from distant provinces could arrive at any moment. Messengers sometimes ran through the streets carrying urgent announcements. Rome was a city that never seemed entirely calm. And yet the Vestals maintained their peaceful routine beside it all. Their role was not to solve political disputes or command armies. Instead, their duty was symbolic. As long as the sacred flame burned, Rome believed the stability of the state remained protected. So the Vestals represented continuity. They represented the steady heart of Roman tradition. And their quiet work carried meaning far beyond the temple walls. Back in the residence, the evening meal was usually prepared as the sky grew darker. The priestesses gathered together again, just as they had earlier in the day. Meals were simple but nourishing. Bread, vegetables, olives, fruit, and sometimes fish were served on wooden or ceramic dishes. Unlike the extravagant banquets enjoyed by wealthy Roman elites, the Vestals' meals remained modest. But they were shared in calm conversation and mutual respect. During these meals, the younger priestesses sometimes asked questions. Questions about rituals they were still learning. Questions about ceremonies they might soon participate in. The older Vestals, many of whom had served for decades, answered patiently. They had once been nervous trainees themselves. And they understood how overwhelming the traditions of Roman religion could seem at first. Sometimes stories were shared during these evenings. Stories about unusual festivals. Stories about strange omens that had once been reported in the city. Or stories about earlier generations of Vestals whose statues now stood in the courtyard garden. These conversations were one of the ways knowledge passed from one generation of priestesses to the next. Because Roman religion depended heavily on memory. Written records existed, of course. But many rituals had been preserved through centuries simply because priestesses taught them carefully to those who came after them. After the evening meal, the residents gradually became quiet again. Some Vestals returned to private study. Others spent time walking in the courtyard before nightfall. And eventually, the temple once again required its nighttime watch. The sacred flame would burn through the darkness just as it had every night for centuries. And somewhere nearby, a Vestal priestess would remain awake, ensuring that the symbol of Rome's spiritual protection never faded. Beyond the temple walls, the enormous city slowly drifted toward sleep. Torches flickered along the streets. Shadows moved across the ancient stone roads. And high above the rooftops, the night sky spread silently over the empire's capital. Inside the temple, the fire continued to glow. A steady light in the quiet darkness. Guarded by priestesses whose entire lives were shaped by this simple, powerful duty. And so another day in the life of the Vestal virgins came gently to an end. Only to begin again with the soft light of the next morning. As night deepened over Rome, the temple district entered one of its quietest hours. Most of the city had already retreated indoors. The lively arguments of the forum had faded away, and the market stalls stood empty until morning. But the sacred fire of Vesta still burned. Inside the round temple, the glow of the flame cast soft, moving shadows along the curved walls. The columns around the temple allowed cool night air to drift gently through the structure, causing the fire to flicker with small, steady movements. The Vestal on night watch remained nearby. She did not pace nervously or move constantly. Instead, she had learned the patient stillness required for this duty. Years of training had prepared her for moments like this. Watching the fire did not require speed. It required attention. Occasionally she would lean forward slightly, checking the strength of the flame. If the wood had burned too low, she added another small piece from the prepared stack beside the hearth. The wood itself had been chosen carefully earlier in the day. It had to be dry. Clean. Free from impurities. Roman religious tradition believed that even the materials used in rituals needed to be handled with care. So the Vestals treated even simple firewood with quiet respect. Outside the temple, the streets were now mostly dark. Torches flickered occasionally along the forum's edges where guards or travelers passed through the area. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked. Another answered from farther away. Then silence returned again. The Vestal listening to these distant sounds understood that Rome never truly slept. Somewhere, soldiers were standing guard. Somewhere, a late traveler hurried home through narrow streets. And somewhere along the banks of the Tiber River, fishermen or night workers might still be finishing their tasks. But inside the temple complex, the calm remained unbroken. Eventually the Vestal's shift would end. Another priestess would arrive quietly, stepping into the temple with slow, careful movements so as not to disturb the peaceful atmosphere. They might exchange a few quiet words. A simple report about the condition of the fire. A brief greeting. Then the first Vestal would return to the residence. Crossing the courtyard under the night sky, she might pause for a moment. Above her, the stars stretched across the Roman sky just as they had for thousands of years. Many ancient people believed the gods watched from those distant lights. And in a way, the Vestals themselves were part of that cosmic order. Their small temple fire symbolized the stability of the world below. When the priestess returned to her chamber, the house of the Vestals was already silent. The corridors were lit only by a few dim oil lamps placed along the walls. Shadows moved softly across the marble floors as the lamps flickered. The rooms of the residents had been designed to remain cool and comfortable, even during Rome's hot summers. Thick stone walls kept the heat outside. High ceilings allowed air to circulate. And small interior courtyards provided fresh breezes. For the Vestals resting inside, sleep came gradually after long days of ritual duty. Tomorrow would bring the same cycle again. Morning inspection of the sacred flame. Preparation of ritual materials. Teaching and learning between older and younger priestesses. Participation in ceremonies when required. And quiet hours spent within the peaceful walls of their home. This predictable rhythm defined their lives. Unlike soldiers who marched to distant battlefields, or politicians who struggled for power in the Senate, the Vestals lived within a carefully structured world. Their service lasted 30 years. The first 10 years were spent learning. The second 10 years were spent performing the full duties of a priestess. And the final 10 years were devoted to teaching the next generation. This long progression created a strong sense of continuity. Every Vestal had once been a student. Every experienced priestess eventually became a mentor. And the knowledge of Roman ritual passed smoothly from one generation to the next. Sometimes visitors were allowed to enter the temple complex during official ceremonies. When they did, they often noticed the calm discipline of the Vestals. Their movements were slow and deliberate. Their expressions composed. Their voices measured. To an outsider, it might appear almost effortless. But behind that calm appearance were decades of careful training. The Vestals had practiced these rituals countless times. They knew exactly where to stand. Exactly when to speak. Exactly how to perform every gesture. This precision helped maintain the powerful symbolism of the temple. Because in Roman belief, correct ritual behavior ensured harmony between the gods and the state. If ceremonies were performed properly, the gods would continue to favor Rome. If mistakes occurred, however, people sometimes feared that misfortune might follow. That belief placed enormous responsibility on the Vestal virgins. Yet day by day, year after year, they fulfilled their duties quietly and consistently. The sacred flame continued burning. The rituals continued being performed. And Rome continued believing that the careful work of these priestesses helped protect the entire city. As the night slowly moved toward dawn once more, the fire inside the temple glowed steadily. Its light reflected softly against the ancient stones. And somewhere within the house of the Vestals, the priestesses rested peacefully, preparing for another calm and unchanging day in the life they had dedicated to the goddess Vesta. As the final hours of the night quietly passed, the sky above Rome slowly began to lighten. At first it was only a faint gray glow along the horizon, barely visible above the rows of tiled rooftops. But gradually that glow spread wider, and the stars began to fade. Inside the temple of Vesta, the sacred flame continued to burn steadily. For the Vestal priestess who had been watching over it during the final part of the night, dawn meant the peaceful conclusion of her shift. The temple was calm. The fire healthy. And soon the morning routines would begin again. Another priestess approached the temple from the nearby residence, her white robes moving softly in the early morning breeze. She stepped carefully onto the temple platform and entered the circular interior. The two Vestals exchanged a quiet greeting. Their conversation was brief and simple. A small update about the condition of the flame. A few calm words acknowledging the change of duty. Then the first priestess slowly returned toward the house of the Vestals, crossing the courtyard while the sky brightened above her. The residence was just beginning to wake. Servants moved through the corridors with brooms and water jars, preparing the building for the new day. One servant might be sweeping marble floors. Another could be carrying fresh water from a nearby source. The faint sounds of their work echoed softly through the hallways. Soon the other Vestals began to awaken as well. One by one they emerged from their rooms, adjusting their robes and preparing for the morning rituals that had structured their lives for years. The first task of the morning always returned to the temple. The sacred flame had to be inspected again in full daylight. Although the night watch ensured the fire remained alive, the morning inspection confirmed that everything was exactly as it should be. The priestess responsible approached the hearth slowly. She examined the flame carefully. She noticed the color of the burning wood. She looked for any excess ash that might need removal. Then, using a simple ritual tool, she gently cleared away the ash and added another piece of prepared firewood. The fire responded with a quiet crackle. Its warm glow filled the center of the temple once more. Outside, the city was waking quickly now. From the nearby Tiber River, the sounds of early workers could sometimes be heard. Boats moved along the water, carrying goods toward the markets. In the streets around the forum, vendors were already arranging their stalls. Fresh bread baked in ovens. Fruit sellers stacked baskets of figs and grapes. Roman citizens hurried along the stone roads, beginning another busy day in the empire's capital. Yet inside the temple complex, the Vestals continued their calm routines without rushing. After the fire inspection, the priestesses often gathered to begin preparations for the day's religious duties. Some days were ordinary. On those days the tasks included maintaining the temple, preparing ritual materials, and teaching the younger priestesses. Other days, however, were connected to important religious festivals. During festivals, the Vestals played visible roles in public ceremonies that drew large crowds to the forum. One such festival was dedicated directly to their goddess, Vesta herself. During the festival of Vestalia, Roman citizens honored the goddess of the hearth and home. For several days the temple opened its inner sanctuary to the public, allowing women from across the city to visit and offer prayers. Normally the inner chamber of the temple remained private. But during this festival, ordinary citizens could approach the sacred space where the eternal flame burned. The Vestals prepared carefully for these occasions. The temple had to be cleaned thoroughly. Offerings arranged neatly. Ritual tools polished and placed in their proper locations. The priestesses themselves wore their most formal ceremonial garments. Their hair was braided carefully in the traditional style, and their white robes were arranged with precise folds. When the crowds arrived, the Vestals stood calmly beside the sacred fire. Visitors moved through the temple respectfully, offering prayers and small gifts to the goddess. Some brought flowers. Others brought small offerings of food or incense. For the Vestals, these festivals were among the busiest times of the year. But even then, their movements remained steady and composed. They guided visitors quietly. They maintained the rituals of the temple. And throughout the entire celebration, the sacred flame continued to burn. Once the festival ended, life returned to the familiar rhythm of ordinary days. The crowds disappeared. The temple became quiet again. And the Vestals resumed their calm routines of tending the flame and preserving ancient traditions. Years passed in this way. A trainee Vestal gradually became an experienced priestess. And eventually she reached the stage where she began teaching new girls who had just arrived at the temple. These young recruits often arrived feeling uncertain or nervous. After all, they had left their families behind to begin a life that would last 30 years. But the older Vestals understood this feeling well. They had once stood in the same courtyard as nervous children themselves. So they guided the newcomers patiently. They explained the rituals slowly. They demonstrated how to move within the temple with calm confidence. Over time, the young trainees adapted to their new life. The temple became familiar. The routines became natural. And the sacred flame, once intimidating, became a comforting presence that connected them to centuries of Roman tradition. Meanwhile the world outside continued to change. New emperors ruled the empire. New monuments appeared in the forum. Victories and defeats shaped Roman history. But inside the Temple of Vesta, one thing remained constant. The quiet dedication of the Vestal virgins. And the steady flame they protected for the city of Rome. As the morning continued to unfold across the city, sunlight slowly filled the open courtyard of the house of the Vestals. The marble columns that surrounded the courtyard reflected the soft golden light, and the shallow pool in the center shimmered gently as the water moved. For the Vestals, this peaceful environment was both their home and their place of service. And over time, the rhythms of life inside these walls became deeply familiar. After the early temple rituals were completed and the sacred flame was carefully tended, many of the priestesses returned to the residence to begin the quieter tasks of the day. One of the most important responsibilities involved preserving sacred knowledge. Roman religion was ancient, even by Roman standards. Many of the rituals performed in the Temple of Vesta had existed for centuries before the empire itself was formed. Because of this, the Vestals acted not only as caretakers of the sacred flame but also as guardians of tradition. Some mornings were devoted to studying religious texts and instructions that had been written on scrolls and tablets. These texts explained the proper ways to perform ceremonies. They described the symbolic meaning behind certain rituals. And they recorded details about past festivals and important events connected to the temple. The Vestals were among the few women in Roman society who received formal education. They learned to read and write. They studied religious law. And they memorized prayers that had been spoken for generations. A young trainee Vestal might spend many hours sitting beside an older priestess, carefully repeating a prayer until every word was perfectly pronounced. Because in Roman belief, even a small mistake in ritual speech could weaken the power of the ceremony. So patience was required. Memory was essential. And practice was constant. Meanwhile, the older Vestals watched carefully. Their role during the final decade of service was to teach. By that point they had spent 20 years inside the temple complex. They understood every detail of the rituals. They had participated in countless ceremonies and festivals. And they knew exactly how to guide the younger priestesses toward the same calm mastery. Teaching often took place in the shaded corridors around the courtyard. The open arches allowed fresh air to move through the building, making these spaces comfortable even during the warmer seasons. Sometimes a senior Vestal demonstrated the correct way to prepare ritual offerings. Other times she explained the symbolism behind a specific ceremony. The younger priestesses listened attentively, knowing that one day they would be responsible for performing these duties themselves. Outside the temple complex, Rome was becoming busier by the hour. In the Roman Forum, crowds gathered to hear speeches and conduct business. Messengers arrived with news from distant provinces. Merchants displayed goods brought from across the Mediterranean world. But from within the house of the Vestals, this busy activity felt distant. The priestesses lived at the very center of Roman public life. Yet their own routines remained quiet and structured. Occasionally, however, the Vestals were called upon to take part in public ceremonies that connected them directly with the people of the city. During certain festivals, they walked in formal processions through the streets. Crowds watched respectfully as the priestesses passed. Children sometimes pointed in curiosity at the distinctive white garments and braided hairstyles that marked the Vestals as sacred figures. Roman citizens believed the presence of a Vestal brought good fortune. So people often stepped aside to give them a clear path. In some cases, prisoners being led to punishment hoped desperately to encounter one. Because if a condemned person happened to meet a Vestal virgin on the way to execution, the law allowed the priestess to grant a pardon. It was an extraordinary power, and one that reflected the immense respect Roman society held for these priestesses. Yet even with such privileges, the Vestals remained bound by strict rules. Their vow of purity lasted for the entire 30 years of their service. Their behavior in public had to reflect dignity and restraint. And their loyalty to the goddess Vesta was expected to remain absolute. Back inside the residence, the afternoon approached quietly. The sun climbed higher above the rooftops of Rome, and the courtyard garden filled with warm light. Some Vestals walked slowly among the plants and statues, enjoying a few peaceful moments between duties. Others returned to study or continued learning rituals under the guidance of their mentors. Servants moved through the building preparing the midday meal. And throughout it all, the temple nearby remained under constant care. The sacred flame continued burning. Its quiet glow symbolized the endurance of Rome itself. Generations of Vestals had tended that fire before the current priestesses were born. And future generations would continue the same duty long after their own service ended. The priestesses understood this continuity. Their lives were only a small part of a tradition that stretched far into the past. And that sense of timeless purpose shaped the peaceful, deliberate pace of their daily lives. So while the outside world rushed with politics, trade, and ambition, inside the temple complex, the Vestals lived in a calmer rhythm. A rhythm measured not by the noise of the city, but by the steady flame that had burned quietly for centuries. As midday approached in the house of the Vestals, the quiet routine of the temple complex continued with the same calm rhythm that had shaped life there for centuries. The sun now stood high above the city, casting bright light into the open courtyard. The shallow pool at the center reflected the sky, and gentle ripples moved across the surface whenever a breeze passed through the arches. For the priestesses living here, midday was often one of the more peaceful parts of the day. Most of the morning rituals had already been completed. The sacred flame had been carefully inspected, offerings prepared, sacred tools cleaned and returned to their proper storage. And now the Vestals had a brief period of quieter work and rest. Some of the priestesses spent this time copying important documents. The Vestals were trusted with the care of certain sacred and legal records belonging to the Roman state. These documents were sometimes stored within the temple complex because the Vestals were considered among the most trustworthy guardians in the city. Their sacred status meant that few people would ever dare to interfere with anything placed under their protection. So on some days, a Vestal might sit beside a small table in one of the residence chambers, carefully copying lines of text onto a fresh scroll. The work required patience. Ink had to be applied slowly, each letter shaped carefully. Mistakes were not easily corrected. But the Vestals had learned long ago that their lives were built on careful attention to detail. Other priestesses spent the midday hours walking through the shaded corridors of the residence. The architecture of the house of the Vestals helped protect them from the intense Roman heat. High ceilings and open courtyards allowed air to circulate, keeping the interior relatively cool even during summer. Sometimes 2 or 3 Vestals walked together in quiet conversation. They might discuss upcoming ceremonies, or talk about the lessons being taught to the newest trainees. Occasionally they shared memories from earlier years of service. Because the priestesses living in the residence often represented several generations at once. The youngest trainees might be only 10 or 11 years old, still adjusting to their new life away from family. The middle group of priestesses were in the full years of their service, responsible for most of the daily rituals. And the oldest Vestals, those approaching the end of their 30-year commitment, acted as mentors and teachers. This structure created a unique community inside the temple complex. Knowledge flowed naturally from older priestesses to younger ones. And over time, every Vestal learned the full responsibilities of the role. While this quiet life continued within the temple walls, the larger world of Rome remained constantly active just outside. Beyond the residence stood the busy buildings of the Roman Forum, where citizens gathered for business, politics, and public events. From the upper levels of the Vestal residence, it was sometimes possible to hear faint echoes of speeches or debates drifting through the air. Senators argued about laws. Officials announced decisions. Crowds responded with cheers or complaints depending on the news. But the Vestals rarely participated in those political struggles. Their role was religious rather than political. Yet the Roman state still depended on them symbolically. The sacred flame they guarded represented the stability of Rome itself. As long as that fire continued burning, many Romans believed the gods still favored their city. Because of this belief, the Vestals held a respected and somewhat mysterious position in Roman society. They were both visible and separate. Citizens saw them during festivals and public ceremonies. But most of their lives were spent quietly inside the temple complex. After the midday hours passed, preparations sometimes began for afternoon rituals or special ceremonies. Certain days in the Roman calendar required specific offerings to different gods. And the Vestals occasionally assisted other priests during these events. For example, during ceremonies connected with the protection of the Roman state, the presence of the Vestals symbolized the unity between the gods and the city. Their calm appearance reassured people that sacred traditions were being maintained exactly as they had been for generations. The Vestals understood this symbolic importance. And so even their posture during ceremonies mattered. They stood straight, moved slowly, spoke clearly when required, and remained composed even in front of large crowds. Years of training had taught them how to maintain this calm dignity. By late afternoon, the sunlight in the courtyard began to soften again. Shadows from the columns stretched longer across the marble floors. The air cooled slightly as the sun moved toward the western horizon. Once again the temple of Vesta required attention. The sacred flame would soon enter another evening cycle. Fresh wood needed to be prepared. Ash removed carefully. And the temple interior arranged for the coming night. The Vestals moved through these duties quietly, just as they had done countless times before. Each day in the temple complex followed a pattern that had been repeated for centuries. Morning inspection of the flame. Preparation of ritual materials. Teaching and learning among the priestesses. Participation in ceremonies when required. Evening care of the sacred fire. And finally the calm night watch that protected the flame until dawn returned again. For the Vestals, life unfolded slowly within this rhythm. While emperors ruled and armies marched beyond the city walls, the priestesses of Vesta continued their quiet service, guarding a small fire that Romans believed held the safety of their entire civilization. And so another peaceful afternoon passed within the house of the Vestals. The courtyard fountains continued their gentle sound. The temple flame continued its steady glow. And the ancient traditions of Rome continued through the calm dedication of the priestesses who watched over them. As the afternoon slowly gave way to evening, the city of Rome began to soften its pace. The noise of the markets gradually faded. Merchants packed away their remaining goods, covering baskets of fruit and stacking empty crates for the next day. In the distance, along the banks of the Tiber River, boats returned to their docks after a long day of carrying supplies through the city. But within the quiet walls of the house of the Vestals, the day's rhythm continued calmly. The priestesses prepared for one of the most important transitions of their daily routine. The evening care of the sacred flame. Inside the circular temple of Vesta, the fire had burned steadily since morning. Its warm glow filled the small chamber, casting gentle shadows along the curved stone walls. For the Vestals, this flame was more than a simple fire. It represented the life of Rome itself. Roman citizens believed that as long as the sacred flame remained alive, the city would continue to stand strong under the protection of the gods. Because of this belief, the priestesses treated their duty with careful attention. One Vestal slowly approached the hearth carrying a small bundle of prepared wood. The wood used for the sacred flame was always chosen carefully. It had to be dry, clean, and suitable for maintaining a steady burn throughout the night. She placed one piece gently onto the glowing embers. The fire responded with a quiet crackling sound as the new wood caught the flame. Another priestess used a simple tool to remove small amounts of ash that had gathered during the day. This helped the fire breathe more easily, allowing it to burn brighter and more evenly. The entire process was done slowly and with quiet concentration. No sudden movements. No loud voices. Only the soft sounds of fire and the faint echo of footsteps inside the temple. Outside, the sky above Rome began to change colors. Golden sunlight faded into deep shades of orange and purple. The rooftops of the city glowed briefly before the light slipped below the horizon. As evening approached, oil lamps were lit throughout the temple complex. Small flames flickered in the corridors of the house of the Vestals, illuminating the marble floors and painted walls. Servants moved quietly through the residence, completing their final tasks of the day. Soon the priestesses gathered for their evening meal. Meals in the Vestal residence were simple but nourishing. Bread, olives, fruits, and vegetables were common parts of their diet, sometimes accompanied by cheese or small portions of fish. The meal itself was usually calm and unhurried. The Vestals sat together, speaking softly about the day's events. A trainee might ask a question about a ritual she had practiced earlier. An older priestess might offer advice or gently correct a small mistake. These conversations help strengthen the sense of community within the residence. For many years, the Vestals lived together almost like a family. They shared responsibilities. They shared knowledge. And over time they shared memories of countless ceremonies and festivals performed in the service of the goddess Vesta. After the meal ended, the evening routines continued. Some priestesses returned briefly to the temple to check the condition of the sacred flame once more before nightfall. Others prepared the materials needed for the night watch. Each night, one Vestal remained responsible for guarding the flame while the others slept. This duty rotated among the priestesses so that everyone shared the responsibility equally. The night watch was quiet, often peaceful. The priestess assigned to this role sat near the hearth, watching the steady glow of the sacred fire. The temple doors remained closed, and the sounds of the city slowly faded as darkness spread across Rome. Occasionally distant footsteps or voices could be heard drifting from the streets of the Roman Forum. But most of the time, the temple was silent. The only constant sound was the gentle crackle of burning wood. For the priestess keeping watch, these hours allowed time for quiet reflection. She might think about the long history of the temple. Generations of Vestals had performed this same duty before her. Women whose names were now remembered only in old records or faded inscriptions. Yet each of them had once sat beside this same sacred flame, protecting it through the night. And now it was her turn to continue that tradition. Outside, the stars slowly appeared above the rooftops of Rome. The city settled into sleep. Homes across the empire's capital dimmed their lamps. Street activity grew quiet. But within the Temple of Vesta, the small eternal fire continued to glow steadily in the darkness. A symbol of stability. A symbol of tradition. And a reminder that even as the world outside changed with each passing generation, some rituals remained the same. The Vestal Virgin on watch adjusted another small piece of wood onto the fire. The flame flickered gently, casting warm light across the temple floor. And through the quiet hours of the night, she continued her silent duty. Guarding the sacred flame of Rome. As night settled more deeply over Rome, the city slowly slipped into a quieter rhythm. Most homes had already extinguished their lamps. The busy roads that surrounded the Forum became still, interrupted only occasionally by the footsteps of a late traveler or the distant call of a night watchman. But inside the Temple of Vesta, the sacred flame continued to glow. The priestess assigned to the night watch remained seated near the circular hearth. Her responsibility was simple in description, yet immense in importance. She had to ensure that the sacred fire never went out. Roman tradition held that the flame represented the spirit of the city itself. As long as it burned, Rome was protected. If it were ever extinguished, many Romans believed it could signal danger or misfortune for the state. Because of this belief, the Vestals treated the fire with constant care. The priestess on watch would occasionally stand and walk slowly around the hearth. She checked the burning wood. She watched the movement of the flames. And from time to time she gently adjusted the logs to keep the fire steady. The temple itself was peaceful at this hour. The circular walls reflected the warm light of the fire, creating soft patterns that shifted slowly across the stone floor. Above, the open center of the temple roof allowed a small view of the night sky. Through that opening, stars shimmered faintly above the quiet city. For the Vestal keeping watch, these hours could feel almost timeless. The outside world seemed far away. The noise of the Forum had faded. Even the nearby streets were quiet. Only the soft crackling of the fire and the occasional whisper of wind passing through the temple disturbed the silence. Sometimes, during these quiet hours, the priestess might remember the stories she had been taught as a trainee. Stories about the early days of Rome. Stories about how the sacred flame had been kept alive through wars, political struggles, and centuries of change. One famous story involved the ancient king Numa Pompilius, who according to Roman tradition organized many of the city's earliest religious practices. It was said that he established the priesthood of the Vestals and entrusted them with the eternal flame of Vesta. Whether the story was fully historical or partly legendary, it reminded the priestesses of how ancient their responsibilities truly were. The flame they guarded had symbolically burned since the earliest days of Rome. And every Vestal who watched over it became part of that long tradition. Eventually the night would pass slowly toward morning. The stars faded. The horizon beyond the city walls began to lighten. And as dawn approached once again, the priestess on watch prepared to pass her duty to another. Another Vestal would arrive quietly from the residence. They would exchange a few calm words. The flame would be inspected. Fresh wood added if needed. And the daily cycle of temple life would begin again. Day after day. Year after year. For the Vestals, time moved in these repeating patterns. Yet their lives also contained moments of unusual responsibility. Because sometimes the Vestals were entrusted with tasks far beyond tending the flame. For example, Roman leaders occasionally placed extremely important documents under the protection of the Vestals. Wills, treaties, and other valuable records were sometimes stored inside the temple complex. One of the most famous examples involved the Roman leader Julius Caesar. Before his death, Caesar arranged for his will to be kept in the care of the Vestals. After the dramatic events of the assassination of Julius Caesar, the Vestals brought the document forward so it could be read publicly. This moment had enormous consequences for Roman history. The will revealed Caesar's chosen heir and helped shape the political future of Rome. Yet through all of these important events, the Vestals themselves remained calm and dignified. Their role was not to influence politics. Instead, they represented continuity and sacred trust. A stable presence in a city that was often filled with dramatic changes. And so life inside the temple complex continued quietly. The sacred flame burned. The priestesses studied ancient rituals. Young trainees learned their duties. And Rome itself moved forward through another generation of history. While armies marched across distant lands and emperors ruled from grand palaces, the Vestal virgins continued their steady work beside a small eternal fire. A fire that symbolized the heart of Rome. And the quiet devotion of the priestesses who protected it through every night and every dawn. As another morning slowly arrived in the city, the quiet life inside the temple complex continued with its familiar rhythm. The sacred flame had survived another night. The priestess who had guarded it through the darkness stepped away from the hearth with calm satisfaction, knowing that her watch had been successful. Soon another Vestal arrived to begin the new day's duties. Together they inspected the fire once more. Fresh wood was added. Ash was gently cleared away. And the steady glow of the sacred flame continued without interruption. For the priestesses of Vesta, each morning also carried a deeper reminder. Their service had not begun by accident. Every Vestal had once been carefully chosen for this role when she was still a young child. In ancient Rome, the selection of a new Vestal virgin was an important and serious event. Only a small number of priestesses served at any given time, usually 6. So whenever one completed her 30-year period of service, a new girl had to be selected to take her place. The process of choosing a Vestal began with a careful search among the families of Rome. Traditionally, the candidates came from respected Roman households. The girls were usually between the ages of 6 and 10. They had to be healthy. They had to come from families whose parents were both still living. And they had to meet several other requirements connected to Roman tradition. Once a group of suitable candidates had been identified, the final decision was made by the chief priest of Roman religion, known as the Pontifex Maximus. In later periods of Roman history, this powerful religious position was held by emperors themselves. But regardless of who held the title, the selection of a Vestal was treated with great respect. According to tradition, the chosen girl was selected almost as if by fate. Some ancient descriptions even suggest that the final choice might be made through a form of ceremonial drawing or symbolic selection. When the decision was made, the young girl left her family home and entered the service of the goddess Vesta. This moment was emotional for everyone involved. For the girl, it meant leaving the life she had known. For her parents, it meant watching their daughter begin a sacred duty that would last 30 years. But becoming a Vestal also brought great honor to the family. Roman society respected the priestesses deeply. Their sacred role placed them among the most trusted figures in the city. When the young girl first arrived at the temple complex near the Roman Forum, she was welcomed by the older Vestals who already lived there. These experienced priestesses understood exactly what the new trainee might be feeling. After all, they had once arrived here as children themselves. So the first days were spent helping the new Vestal become familiar with her new surroundings. She learned the layout of the temple. She walked through the quiet courtyards of the house of the Vestals. She saw the sacred hearth where the eternal flame burned. And slowly she began to understand the importance of the place where she would spend the next decades of her life. Training began gently at first. Young trainees were not immediately given major responsibilities. Instead, they spent their early years learning the traditions and rituals that shaped Roman religious life. They watched older priestesses perform ceremonies. They memorized prayers. They practiced the careful movements required during sacred rituals. One of the first lessons every trainee learned was the proper respect for the sacred flame itself. The fire inside the temple was never to be treated casually. Approaching the hearth required calm movements and focused attention. The trainee would watch carefully as a senior Vestal demonstrated how to place wood onto the embers. How to remove ash without disturbing the flame. How to observe the fire and understand its condition. These lessons might seem simple, but they carried enormous meaning within Roman religion. Because for centuries, the Vestals had been responsible for ensuring that the flame never went out. If it ever did extinguish accidentally, the event was considered a serious omen for the city. Ancient writers recorded that in such situations, the priestesses were expected to relight the flame using special ritual methods. Sometimes this involved focusing sunlight through a polished surface to create a new spark. Other times sacred materials were used in ceremonial ways to restore the fire. But everyone hoped such a moment would never occur. So the Vestals practiced their duties with extreme care. Years passed as the young trainee gradually became more confident. She moved from watching rituals to assisting them, and eventually to performing them herself. By the time she reached the middle years of her service, she had become one of the experienced priestesses guiding the younger generation. And so the cycle continued. New girls arrived. Older Vestals completed their service. And the sacred traditions of Rome passed quietly from one generation to the next. All while the small flame in the temple continued burning. A steady glow beside the busy heart of the Roman world. Whenever you're ready, I can continue the next long section, where we explore daily life of Vestal trainees. Their special clothing and hairstyles. How Roman citizens viewed them in public. As the young trainees slowly grew accustomed to life inside the temple complex, their days began to follow the same gentle rhythm that had guided the Vestals for centuries. Morning always began early. The first light of dawn slipped across the rooftops of Rome and into the courtyard of the house of the Vestals. Soft sunlight touched the marble columns and the small garden plants that grew beside the central pool. For the trainees, this quiet moment marked the beginning of another day of learning. One of the older priestesses would gather the younger girls together and guide them toward the temple of Vesta. There, they would stand quietly near the circular hearth while the senior Vestal inspected the sacred flame. The trainees watched carefully. Every movement mattered. How the wood was placed into the fire. How the ashes were removed. How the priestess approached the hearth slowly and respectfully. These actions were not rushed. They were deliberate and calm, reflecting the sacred nature of the task. After the morning inspection of the flame, the trainees often began their lessons. These lessons included memorizing ancient prayers that had been spoken in the temple for generations. The words were sometimes old and formal, belonging to a style of Latin that had been used in religious ceremonies long before the Roman Empire existed. So the young Vestals repeated the prayers carefully, guided by the voices of their teachers. Sometimes the lessons took place in the shaded corridors of the residence. Other times they happened in quiet rooms where scrolls and tablets were stored. The Vestals were among the few women in Roman society who received a strong education. They learned to read. They learned to write. They studied the traditions of Roman religion and the meanings behind many ceremonies. This education was necessary because the Vestals often assisted in important rituals that affected the entire Roman state. Beyond religious study, the trainees also learned how to behave with dignity and composure. When the Vestals appeared in public ceremonies, they represented sacred tradition. Roman citizens expected them to move calmly, speak clearly, and maintain a quiet confidence. So part of their training involved practicing these public appearances. They learned how to walk in ceremonial processions, how to stand beside other priests during religious events, and how to interact respectfully with citizens who approached them during festivals. Over time, the trainees also became familiar with the special clothing worn by the Vestal priestesses. Their garments were simple but symbolic. Most often they wore long white robes, representing purity and dedication to the goddess Vesta. Their hair was arranged in a distinctive style known as the sani crines, a traditional braided arrangement that had ancient roots in Roman culture. This hairstyle was carefully prepared and tied with ribbons, creating a recognizable appearance that marked the wearer as a Vestal. When citizens of ancient Rome saw this clothing and hairstyle, they immediately understood that the woman before them was one of the sacred priestesses. And with that recognition came respect. Roman society treated the Vestals with unusual privileges. They were allowed to travel through the city accompanied by attendants. Crowds often stepped aside to give them space when they walked through the streets. And during major ceremonies in the Roman Forum, the Vestals were given honored seating so they could observe the events. These privileges reflected how deeply Roman religion valued their service. But along with these honors came strict expectations. The Vestals had vowed to remain dedicated entirely to their sacred duties for 30 years. Their behavior had to reflect discipline and seriousness. Every action they took in public represented not only themselves but also the traditions of the temple and the goddess Vesta. For the young trainees, learning to balance these expectations took time. At first they were simply curious children exploring their new home. They asked questions. They made small mistakes. They occasionally forgot parts of the long prayers they were learning. But the older Vestals were patient teachers. They corrected gently. They demonstrated the rituals again. And slowly the trainees grew more confident in their roles. Years passed quietly inside the temple complex. The girls who had once arrived as nervous children gradually became experienced priestesses themselves. They now stood beside the sacred flame with steady hands. They taught new trainees the lessons they had once learned. And through this cycle of teaching and learning, the traditions of the Vestals continued. Outside the temple walls, the city of Rome continued its busy life. Crowds gathered in the Roman Forum. Merchants traded goods from distant provinces. Soldiers marched through the streets on their way to new assignments. But inside the temple of Vesta, time seemed to move more slowly. The sacred flame still burned quietly at the center of the circular hearth. And the priestesses who watched over it carried forward a tradition that connected the present city to its ancient past. Night would eventually come again. The temple lamps would be lit. And once more, a Vestal would take her place beside the eternal flame, watching over it through the silent hours until morning returned to Rome. As the years passed inside the temple complex, the young trainees slowly became fully trained priestesses. The routines that had once felt unfamiliar gradually became second nature. They no longer needed constant guidance when approaching the sacred hearth. They knew exactly how to care for the fire, how to prepare ritual tools, and how to perform the ancient prayers that echoed through the temple. Life inside the house of the Vestals remained quiet. But the priestesses did not live completely separated from the outside world. At certain times of the year, the Temple of Vesta became one of the most visited sacred places in the entire city. This happened during an important Roman festival known as Vestalia. Vestalia was celebrated every year in early summer. During this period, Roman citizens came to honor the goddess of the hearth and home. For most of the year, the inner part of the temple remained closed to ordinary visitors. Only the Vestals themselves could enter the sacred space where the eternal flame burned. But during the days of Vestalia, something unusual happened. The temple doors were opened. For a short time, women from across the city were allowed to enter and approach the sacred hearth. This was a rare and special opportunity. Roman households believed that the goddess Vesta protected their homes, their families, and the warmth of their household fires. So many women came to the temple carrying offerings. Some brought flowers. Others carried small baskets of food or grains. Some simply came to stand quietly near the sacred flame and whisper a prayer. The Vestals guided these visitors calmly through the temple. They ensured that everyone moved respectfully and that the sacred space remained peaceful. Even during the busiest hours of the festival, the priestesses maintained their steady composure. The crowds might grow large outside the temple near the Roman Forum, but inside the circular chamber, the atmosphere remained calm. The sacred flame burned at the center of everything. Its warm light flickered gently as people passed through the temple. For the Vestals, Vestalia was both a time of great activity and a reminder of the deep connection between their sacred duties and the everyday lives of Roman citizens. While the priestesses themselves lived within the temple complex, the goddess they served represented the hearth of every Roman home. In this way, the small fire burning in the temple symbolized thousands of household fires across the city. Each home had its own hearth. Each family gathered around its own small flame. And all of those flames were spiritually connected to the sacred fire of Vesta. After several days of celebration, the festival eventually came to an end. The temple was cleaned carefully. Offerings were removed. The inner sanctuary returned to its normal quiet state. Once again, the temple became a private sacred space watched over only by the Vestal priestesses. The crowds disappeared from the temple steps. The busy energy of the festival faded. And life returned to its slow and steady rhythm inside the house of the Vestals. Morning inspections of the flame continued. Lessons for the younger trainees resumed. And the quiet sound of footsteps echoed again through the marble corridors. But even outside the festival days, Roman citizens remained aware of the presence of the Vestals in their city. Seeing a Vestal walking through the streets was considered a fortunate moment. People believed their presence carried blessings. So when a priestess passed through the roads near the Roman Forum, many citizens stepped respectfully aside. Some offered quiet greetings. Others simply watched with curiosity and admiration. The Vestals themselves moved calmly through these moments. Their training had prepared them to maintain dignity in public spaces. They understood that their appearance represented the sacred traditions of Rome. And so they walked slowly, accompanied by attendants who ensured their path remained clear. Eventually the day would end again. The sun would set beyond the hills surrounding the city. The lights of Rome would dim. And once more, the Vestals returned to the temple to prepare the sacred flame for the night. Fresh wood was placed carefully onto the embers. Ash was removed gently. The fire was arranged so it could burn steadily through the long hours of darkness. And when everything was ready, one priestess took her place beside the hearth. The night watch began again. Outside, the city slowly drifted into sleep. But inside the temple of Vesta, the eternal flame continued to glow quietly. Guarded by the priestesses who had dedicated their lives to protecting it. A small fire at the heart of ancient Rome. Burning steadily through another peaceful Roman night. Whenever you're ready, I can continue the next section, where we explore what happened if the sacred flame ever went out. The strict rules the Vestals had to follow. The final years when a Vestal completed her 30-year service. After the lively days of the festival passed and the temple returned to its peaceful routine, the Vestals continued their daily service just as they always had. The sacred flame burned quietly in the center of the circular temple. Day after day, the priestesses approached the hearth with calm focus. They inspected the fire. They removed ash. They placed fresh pieces of wood onto the glowing embers. For the citizens of Rome, this ritual might have appeared simple. But to the Vestals, every movement carried deep meaning. The fire symbolized the safety and stability of the Roman state. So the priestesses treated it with constant attention. Yet Roman tradition also carried a lingering fear. What would happen if the sacred flame ever went out? It was a rare event, but ancient writers recorded that it did occasionally happen. Perhaps a strong wind blew through the temple. Perhaps the wood burned faster than expected. Or perhaps simple human error caused the fire to fade. When the flame extinguished, Romans believed it was a troubling sign. Many saw it as an omen suggesting that the gods might be displeased or that danger could threaten the city. Because of this belief, the Vestals were required to relight the fire using special ritual methods. The new flame could not simply be started in an ordinary way. Instead, ancient tradition required the fire to be rekindled through sacred means. One method involved focusing sunlight through a polished surface or mirror-like object. When the sunlight gathered into a single bright point, it could ignite a small piece of prepared material. From that spark, the new sacred flame would be carefully built again. The process required patience and concentration. But once the fire was restored, the temple returned to its calm rhythm. Moments like this reminded the Vestals of how important their responsibilities truly were. The flame they guarded was not merely symbolic. It represented the relationship between the gods and the Roman people. And so the priestesses treated their duty with deep seriousness. Alongside the responsibility for the sacred fire, the Vestals also followed strict rules that shaped every part of their lives. The most famous of these rules was their vow of purity. For 30 years, a Vestal devoted herself completely to the service of the goddess Vesta. This vow symbolized the sacred nature of the temple and the priestesses who protected it. The 30 years of service were traditionally divided into 3 stages. The first 10 years were spent learning. Young trainees studied rituals, memorized prayers, and observed the experienced priestesses performing ceremonies. The next 10 years were the period of full service. During this time, the Vestal performed the most important duties of the temple. She cared for the sacred flame. She participated in public religious ceremonies. And she helped maintain the sacred traditions of Rome. The final 10 years were devoted to teaching. By this stage, the priestess had many years of experience. She guided new trainees, explaining rituals and demonstrating the correct methods of worship. Through this structure, knowledge passed naturally from one generation of Vestals to the next. While their duties were serious, the Vestals also enjoyed certain freedoms that were unusual for women in Roman society. They could own property. They could manage their own wealth. They could travel through the city with special respect and protection. When they appeared in public near the Roman Forum, citizens recognized them immediately. Their white garments and braided hairstyles marked them as sacred figures. People stepped aside to let them pass. Sometimes crowds even grew quiet as a Vestal walked through the street. This respect reflected the deep connection Romans felt toward the priestesses and the goddess they served. Yet life inside the temple complex remained calm and simple despite these privileges. Most days were quiet. The Vestals moved between the temple and their residence. They studied sacred traditions. They prepared ritual materials. They taught younger trainees. And they watched over the sacred flame. As the years passed, a priestess slowly approached the end of her 30-year service. This moment was both joyful and emotional. After 3 decades inside the temple complex, the Vestal had completed her sacred duty. For the first time since childhood, she was free to choose a different life. Some former Vestals decided to marry and begin families. Others chose to live quietly, respected by Roman society for their many years of service. But regardless of the path they chose, their time in the temple always remained an important part of their identity. They had guarded the sacred flame of Rome. They had preserved ancient traditions. And they had lived at the spiritual center of one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. Meanwhile, new trainees continued to arrive. Young girls stepped through the temple gates for the first time. Older priestesses guided them through their lessons. And the cycle of Vestal life continued once more. Outside the temple, the city of Rome kept growing and changing. Emperors ruled. Buildings rose. Crowds filled the streets near the Roman Forum. But inside the temple of Vesta, one thing remained constant. The sacred flame still burned quietly at the center of the hearth. A small fire. Glowing steadily through the centuries of ancient Rome. And beside that flame stood the Vestal virgins, continuing their quiet watch. As time passed quietly within the temple complex, the life of each Vestal slowly unfolded through the many years of her service. What had once seemed like a distant future when she first arrived as a young trainee eventually became reality. The early lessons. The careful memorization of prayers. The nervous first steps toward the sacred hearth. All of these moments gradually transformed into calm confidence. By the middle years of her service, a Vestal moved through the temple with practiced ease. She knew every corner of the house of the Vestals. She recognized the subtle sounds of the temple at different times of day. The gentle echo of footsteps in the morning corridors. The quiet murmur of servants preparing the residence. The familiar crackle of the sacred flame burning inside the circular temple. These small details became part of daily life. And over time they created a peaceful rhythm that shaped the priestess's world. One of the most interesting aspects of the Vestals' role in Roman society was the unusual trust placed in them. Because they were considered sacred and honorable figures, the Roman state often entrusted them with important objects and documents. Among these were valuable records, legal agreements, and even the wills of powerful Roman leaders. One well-known example involved the Roman general and statesman Julius Caesar. Before his death during the dramatic assassination of Julius Caesar, Caesar placed his will under the protection of the Vestals. When the document was later revealed, it played an important role in shaping the political future of Rome. This moment demonstrated how deeply Roman society trusted the priestesses. Their sacred position made them neutral guardians of important materials. They stood outside the usual struggles of politics and ambition. Inside the temple complex, however, daily life continued calmly. Morning rituals still began with the careful inspection of the sacred flame. Fresh wood was added to the hearth. Ash was cleared away gently. And the warm glow of the fire spread across the temple floor. The Vestals approached these duties with the same patience they had practiced for years. Young trainees watched closely. They observed how experienced priestesses moved around the hearth. They listened to the instructions passed down through generations. And slowly they learned how to perform these rituals themselves. Teaching was an important part of the later years of a Vestal service. The priestesses who had spent decades inside the temple carried a deep understanding of Roman religious tradition. Their responsibility was to ensure that every detail of the rituals continued correctly. So they guided the younger girls step by step. They corrected mistakes gently. They demonstrated the proper movements during ceremonies. And they repeated the ancient prayers that had echoed in the temple for centuries. Outside the temple walls, the city continued to grow and change. Crowds gathered daily in the Roman Forum. New buildings rose around the public squares. Victorious generals returned from distant campaigns. And Roman citizens debated politics in busy streets and marketplaces. Yet inside the Temple of Vesta, time seemed to move at a slower pace. The same rituals continued year after year. The same sacred flame burned quietly at the center of the hearth. And the Vestal priestesses maintained the traditions that connected Rome's present to its distant past. Eventually, after 30 years of service, a Vestal reached the final stage of her sacred duty. This moment marked the completion of a long journey that had begun when she was only a child. For 3 decades she had lived inside the temple complex. She had learned the ancient rituals. She had protected the sacred flame. She had guided younger trainees as they began their own service. Now her commitment was fulfilled. When a Vestal completed her service, she was allowed to leave the temple and return to ordinary Roman life if she wished. This transition must have felt unusual. After spending most of her life inside the peaceful walls of the temple complex, the busy streets of Rome would have seemed louder and more crowded than she remembered. But Roman society treated former Vestals with deep respect. Their years of sacred service gave them honor and recognition. Some chose to marry and begin families. Others preferred to live quietly, carrying the memory of their temple life with them. Regardless of the path they chose, their role in protecting the sacred flame of Vesta was never forgotten. Meanwhile, inside the temple complex, the cycle continued. New trainees arrived. Older priestesses guided them. And the eternal flame still burned beside the Roman Forum. Through wars, political changes, and the rise of new emperors, the sacred fire remained a constant presence in ancient Rome. A quiet symbol of tradition. A reminder of the ancient beliefs that shaped the Roman world. And at the center of it all stood the Vestal Virgins. Watching over the flame. Through every peaceful night and every returning dawn. As the years of service passed inside the temple complex, each Vestal priestess became deeply familiar with the quiet rhythm of temple life. The days followed one another with gentle predictability. Morning inspections of the sacred flame. Lessons for younger trainees. The preparation of ritual offerings. And the calm evening routines that ensured the fire continued burning through the night. But even within this peaceful routine, there were moments when the Vestals were reminded how serious their responsibilities truly were. Roman religion placed enormous importance on sacred vows. For the Vestals, the most well-known vow was their promise of lifelong purity during the 30 years of service. This vow symbolized their complete dedication to the goddess Vesta and to the spiritual safety of Rome. Because the Vestals represented sacred order, Romans believed that any violation of this vow could bring misfortune upon the city itself. As a result, accusations against a Vestal were treated with great seriousness. Fortunately, such events were rare. Most priestesses completed their entire service with honor. But ancient Roman historians recorded a few dramatic moments when a Vestal was accused of breaking her vow. One of the most famous stories involved a priestess named Tuccia. According to Roman legend, Tuccia was once accused of violating her sacred oath. In Roman society, such an accusation could destroy a priestess's reputation and bring severe punishment. Yet Tuccia insisted that she was innocent. To prove her purity, the story says she prayed to the goddess Vesta and asked for divine help. Then she attempted a remarkable challenge. She carried water from the Tiber River back to the temple using nothing more than a simple sieve. Normally, water would immediately pass through such an object. But according to the legend, the sieve held the water perfectly. Tuccia walked calmly through the streets and arrived at the temple without spilling a single drop. Romans believed this miracle showed that the goddess herself had defended the Vestal's innocence. Stories like this were repeated for generations. They reminded citizens that the Vestals were protected by powerful divine forces. At the same time, these stories also showed how closely the priestesses' lives were connected to Roman belief and superstition. The sacred flame itself was sometimes believed to send messages or warnings. If the fire burned unusually bright, some people thought it signaled good fortune for the city. If it flickered weakly or produced unusual smoke, others worried that it might represent an omen. The Vestals themselves remained calm during these moments. Their training encouraged careful observation rather than panic. They continued their duties exactly as tradition required. Because their role was to maintain stability, even when the outside world became uncertain. And the outside world often did become uncertain. Rome was a powerful empire, but it experienced many periods of political struggle. Emperors rose to power and sometimes fell dramatically. Armies marched across distant provinces. Crowds gathered in the Roman Forum to hear speeches, celebrate victories, or debate new laws. Yet inside the Temple of Vesta, the atmosphere remained calm. The priestesses focused on their sacred responsibilities. They cared for the flame. They preserved ancient rituals. And they passed their knowledge to the next generation of trainees. For the young girls who arrived at the temple gates, this environment slowly became their home. At first the temple complex felt unfamiliar. The corridors were quiet. The rituals were complex. And the responsibility of caring for Rome's sacred fire seemed enormous. But over time, the trainees grew comfortable with their new life. They learned the prayers. They practiced the rituals. And they discovered the peaceful rhythm that had guided the Vestals for centuries. Eventually those same trainees became experienced priestesses themselves. They now stood beside the sacred hearth with calm confidence. They taught younger girls the traditions of the temple. And they continued the long line of women who had served the goddess Vesta. Outside the temple walls, Rome continued to change. New buildings rose around the Roman Forum. New emperors ruled the empire. And the city grew larger and more complex with each passing generation. But within the Temple of Vesta, one quiet symbol remained unchanged. The sacred flame. Its gentle light flickered softly in the center of the circular hearth. And beside that fire stood the Vestal virgins. Guarding it patiently. Through another peaceful night in ancient Rome. As the evening routines inside the temple complex came to a close, the Vestals slowly returned to the quiet spaces of their residence. The house of the Vestals stood just beside the temple itself. It was a large and elegant building, designed to provide both comfort and privacy for the priestesses who lived there. At the center of the residence lay a wide-open courtyard. A small pool of water rested in the middle, reflecting the columns that surrounded it. During the day, sunlight filled this courtyard, warming the marble floors and illuminating the statues placed along the edges. But in the evening, the atmosphere became softer. Oil lamps were lit along the corridors. Their gentle light flickered against the stone walls, creating a peaceful glow throughout the building. The Vestals often spent the final hours of the day in these quiet spaces. Some priestesses walked slowly around the courtyard, enjoying the cool air that moved through the open arches. Others sat together near the pool, speaking softly about the events of the day. The conversations were usually calm and simple. They might discuss a ceremony that had taken place earlier in the temple. Or they might talk about the progress of the youngest trainees who were still learning their lessons. For the Vestals, the residence was more than just a place to sleep. It was the center of their daily lives. The building contained private rooms for the priestesses, small study areas where sacred texts were kept, and larger chambers used for gatherings and lessons. In many ways, the residence functioned almost like a peaceful school. Younger girls learned their duties. Experienced priestesses taught ancient traditions. And knowledge moved quietly from one generation to the next. The walls of the residence also displayed statues of former Vestal virgins. These statues honored priestesses who had served faithfully and brought respect to the order. As the Vestals walked through the courtyard, they sometimes passed these statues and paused for a moment. Each statue represented a woman who had once lived in the same rooms. A woman who had watched over the sacred flame. A woman who had completed the long 30 years of service to the goddess Vesta. These reminders connected the current priestesses to the long history of their order. The Vestals understood that they were part of a tradition stretching far into the past. Generations of women had lived inside these walls. And generations more would follow. Outside the temple complex, the city of Rome slowly settled into nighttime quiet. The busy streets around the Roman Forum grew calmer as shops closed and citizens returned to their homes. From the direction of the Tiber River, the distant sound of water moving along the banks could sometimes be heard. But inside the house of the Vestals, the atmosphere remained peaceful. Eventually the priestesses prepared to rest for the night. One Vestal returned to the temple to begin the night watch beside the sacred hearth. The others slowly withdrew to their rooms. The corridors grew quiet. The lamps continued burning softly along the walls. And the courtyard pool reflected the faint light of the stars above. For the Vestal guarding the temple, the night once again became a time of quiet responsibility. She sat beside the sacred flame and watched the fire carefully. The gentle crackling of wood filled the temple. The warm light moved slowly across the stone floor. And beyond the open roof of the temple, the sky stretched wide above the sleeping city. These quiet hours allowed the priestess time for reflection. She might think about the long history of the temple. About the generations of Vestals who had performed the same duty before her. Or about the young trainees who would one day take her place. Because in the temple of Vesta, time moved in cycles. Priestesses arrived as children. They learned the sacred rituals. They protected the eternal flame. And eventually they passed their knowledge to the next generation. Meanwhile, the sacred fire continued burning. A steady symbol of the city's spiritual life. A small but powerful flame at the heart of ancient Rome. And so the night passed quietly inside the temple complex. The Vestal on watch adjusted the wood in the hearth. The flame flickered gently. And another peaceful Roman night unfolded beneath the stars. As the quiet night deepened over Rome, the temple complex rested in a calm stillness. The small sacred flame continued to glow softly inside the temple of Vesta. Its light moved gently across the stone floor, flickering with each quiet shift of the burning wood. The priestess assigned to the night watch sat near the hearth, observing the fire with patient attention. Outside, the city had grown peaceful. The busy streets that surrounded the Roman Forum were now mostly silent. Only the occasional footsteps of a late traveler or the distant sound of a night guard could be heard drifting through the cool air. Above the temple, the sky stretched wide and dark. Through the open center of the temple roof, stars shimmered faintly over the sleeping city. For the Vestal watching the flame, these quiet hours passed slowly. Her duty was simple but deeply important. She watched the fire. She adjusted the wood when needed. She made sure the sacred flame continued burning steadily through the night. From time to time she rose and walked slowly around the hearth, checking the condition of the embers. The fire responded with a soft crackle whenever a new piece of wood was gently placed among the glowing coals. The warm light filled the circular chamber, reflecting softly against the curved stone walls. Beyond the temple, the house of the Vestals rested in silence. The corridors were dimly lit by a few remaining oil lamps. Their gentle glow flickered along the marble floors and painted walls. Inside their rooms, the other priestesses slept peacefully after the day's rituals. The younger trainees, still adjusting to life within the temple complex, slept quietly in their chambers. For them, each day brought new lessons and new understanding of the sacred duties they had begun to learn. The experienced priestesses rested as well, knowing that the morning rituals would soon arrive again with the rising sun. Time moved slowly during these late hours. The priestess beside the flame could hear small sounds that would normally go unnoticed during the busy daylight hours. The quiet shifting of burning wood. The faint movement of wind passing through the temple opening. Sometimes even the distant murmur of water flowing along the banks of the Tiber River. These gentle sounds formed the quiet music of the night. For generations, Vestal priestesses had listened to these same sounds while guarding the sacred fire. Women whose names were now remembered only in old records and inscriptions. Yet each of them had once sat beside this same hearth, watching the same steady flame. Gradually the darkest hours of night began to pass. Far beyond the rooftops of Rome, the first pale hints of dawn slowly appeared along the horizon. The stars faded one by one. The sky softened from deep black into quiet shades of gray and blue. Inside the temple, the flame continued burning just as it had throughout the night. Soon the next Vestal would arrive from the residence to begin the morning duties. The priestess on watch added one final piece of wood to the hearth and watched as the flame grew brighter. The new day was beginning. Another calm cycle of rituals and traditions would soon unfold inside the temple complex. Footsteps echoed softly across the courtyard as a second priestess approached from the house of the Vestals. She entered the temple quietly and greeted the watchful guardian of the flame. Together they inspected the sacred fire. The embers glowed warmly. The wood burned evenly.